Hi guys, welcome back to the show. I have my next guest on today. His name is Robert Rosen. Is that correct?
That is correct, yes.
All right, Robert, thank you for being with us today.
Yeah.
We're going to learn a bit more about you. We're going to talk a little about your writing career, what it's been like for you so far. We're going to learn, how did you come to possess John Lennon's diaries, and what did you learn about them? That's going to be a very interesting topic to talk about. In a Brooklyn memoir, you use several taboo words, and we're really going to break that down as well. And then we'll talk a little bit about, what was it like working in the porn industry? And obviously you did it when it was more, what's the word I'm trying to use? Not digitized, but more of like it was magazines and different things as that. And obviously it's changed for that.
Right.
So now, you were there in the
for
beginning.
25 years, so it's
25 years. That's crazy.
Things change in 25 years.
Yeah. Well, let's get into the first topic. Who are you, Robert? Like, what can you tell us about us? What is your small upbringing? What is the best idea about you? What do you want people to get to know about Robert?
Well, I'm a writer. I mean, that's like, the main thing I do. I've been writing books full time now since, I left my last job in 2019, and I've been writing books full time since then. I'm working on a book now about the 1970s at City College from the perspective of an underground newspaper there. That's my current project. It's been going on for years. I'm maybe halfway through, but I'm from Brooklyn. I've been a New Yorker pretty much my whole life. I tried Los Angeles way back in 1980. I gravitated back here. In 1975, I moved to Washington, D.C. I got a job, believe it or not, as a speechwriter for the Secretary of the Air Force. And that's amazing. Just was not for me. And again, I gravitated back to New York. I'm married to Mary Lynn Mayscott, who's a singer-songwriter, and we live downtown in Manhattan. Yeah. And let's see, a couple of weeks ago, we just got back from Spain. My book, Nowhere Man, the John Lennon biography, it's been translated into many languages, including Spanish, and it did very well in Latin America and Spain. And the two of us were just invited to Sevilla. I did a reading there with a lot of help with the translating, and Mary Lynn did a concert there with a local band, and this was very cool. And I've been doing stuff like this now for 25 years. I have traveled all over the world promoting Nowhere Man, and I love the opportunity to be able to do things like that.
That's amazing. And how many books are you at currently in your roster?
I've published three books. Nowhere Man, the John Lennon bio, Beaver Street, the history of pornography, and a Brooklyn memoir, which is my latest book, which is about growing up in Brooklyn in the aftermath of World War II, surrounded by Holocaust survivors and World War II veterans who fought the Nazis.
Wow, that's crazy. And think all the history you've seen. I mean, you grew up in New York, so and seen the city come to life and go through so many different changes. I mean, do you think that's been such a great kind of backstory for your writing and for the lessons you've learned and what you kind of transcribe in your stories?
Well, yeah. I mean, I've been here for a long time. I mean, I'm 71 years old. I don't feel 71 years old, but, I am. My brain feels like it's about 20 years old. And, I'm just going to keep doing this as long as I could. And, the New York City, the Brooklyn I was born into in the early 1950s is just unrecognizable as to what New York City's become.
Right. Oh, yeah, I could see that. I mean, gentrification. I mean, I live in Hudson Yards, and like literally, it was nothing but a rail track, which still is, but like it's changed so much. And I've only been here 12 years.
You've been in
Um,
Hudson Yards 10, 12
yeah.
years.
And seeing things differently in different aspects of I'd say neighborhoods change has always been kind of great to see, but also it's kind of sad. You kind of miss some of the older parts of New York and some of the sass of the city and everything else like that. So, but things change. But I think New York is always ever evolving and changing. I
Yeah.
think it was a
What
great
was
city.
really strange is a couple of weeks ago, I walked all the way up on the High Line, and
Hmm.
I saw, oh, look at this. There's a new part of the High Line when you get to to 30th Street and you turn right, and
Right.
then I followed that, and all of a sudden, this new neighborhood with all these skyscrapers had sprung up. What's
Yeah.
it? It's called like Manhattan West or something, and
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
didn't even know it was there. And it was like a completely new neighborhood. There was an ice
Yeah.
skating rink there, and just all these tall buildings. I said, what the hell is going on? Where did this come from? And that's New York. It just changes
It
so
does.
absurdly fast that you can't keep up with what's going on.
Yeah, that's very true. When it comes a little bit about your writing career, you said you've been traveling a lot and promoting your books. What has been any advice you give to any writers out there? What has been some of the best advice or things you've done to really help you through your creative process and come up
The
with your ideas for your
the
stories?
the best advice I've gotten as a writer, is that what you're asking?
Yes.
The best advice I've gotten as a writer was in graduate school at City College.
Hmm.
That I was working with a writer, Francine Duplessis Gray, who died a couple of years ago.
Mm.
And the best piece of writing advice she ever gave me was keep a notebook and write in it every day. And
Mm.
I've been doing that now since 1977. That that is how you find your voice, is that
Yeah.
you just write and you write and you write and you do it every day until writing becomes as natural as breathing. And that always stands out in my mind as the best piece of writing advice I've ever gotten, and
Wow.
I've stuck with it for all these years.
Yeah. And it seems to be serving you very well. What do you think is some of the problems that people have when they say, oh, I have writer's block or, I can't finish a story. I'm just kind of stuck here. How, one, has that really happened to you? And two, what kind of advice do you give these people who are kind of in this level of stuckness? I guess the best word to use it. What would you say to them?
Well, I mean, it's occasionally people do ask me for advice, and I tell them what I just told you: keep a notebook, write in
Hmm.
it every single day. I tell them that there's no such thing as writer's block. If you have writer's block, you just sit down in front of your computer or your typewriter, if you're still using a typewriter, somebody might,
Right.
and you just start throwing words on paper, describe the wall in front of your typewriter. Just like write about anything.
Yeah.
Don't worry about the thing you're supposed to be writing about. And if you just keep doing it, you just write through it, and eventually the right words come. So, that's what I tell them about writer's block. And, part of writing is just being really disciplined. And, I
Yeah.
do work every single day. Our, on the book Beaver Street in particular, uh,
Hmm.
I did not have a contract. I just, this was the book I decided to write, and I sat down every day and I worked on it. And what I did, and it sounds, it sounds really perverse, but I kept a timesheet on myself, and I made sure that I was putting in a certain amount of time every single day, and like,
Right.
not counting looking at a blank screen as working. I actually had to be doing something, and I
Hmm.
would just like clock in, clock out until at a minimum I did 3 hours per day. Even though that 3 hours might stretch over 8 hours. but
Right.
I just made sure. And, that's how the book got done.
Wow, that's amazing. And let's talk a little bit about how you,
Masochistic, but it worked.
well, down the road, it got you where you got to be. And I think that's good. And that's good advice to give out. Because I do think it's very hard for writers sometimes. And I found myself doing the same thing sometimes, is being stuck or feeling like you're stuck. But ideally, you're correct. Sometimes you have to sit down and just like get the words out there. It doesn't be perfect, but just get those thoughts out. You
Yeah,
can always go back
write
later.
anything.
Yeah. Yeah. You can go back later and reconstruct everything. You
Yeah,
don't have to do it all
absolutely.
at once.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly. The
Yeah.
first draft is always the hardest part.
Always. Yes. 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 I had to beat that into submission to myself. But on to the diaries of John Lennon. How did you come in possession of those? And what did you learn about him from them?
Okay, well, everything I learned is in Nowhere Man, and
Mm.
I'd urge people to read that. That's the book that changed my life. That's the book that everybody wants to talk about. That's the book that for 24, 25 years now, people want to know about Nowhere Man because of the information that's in Nowhere Man, and the
Mhm.
fact that it's a fun, interesting book to read. Um, how did I get John Lennon's diaries? I was in the right place at the right time.
Wow.
What happened was a friend of mine from college, somebody who I worked on the college newspaper with. I was
Hmm.
the editor at the time when he joined. His name is Fred Seaman. Um, he lived down the block from me after I moved to Manhattan from Brooklyn.
Hmm.
Um, we became close friends. This is back in like the mid 1970s. And when he graduated from college, he was hired as John Lennon and Yoko Ono's personal assistant. He
Wow.
got the job through family connections. His uncle Norman Seaman had been had produced Yoko Ono's performance art pieces at Carnegie Hall in the early 1960s. His aunt, Helen Seaman, was Sean Lennon's nanny, his governess. Um,
Wow.
they needed a PA, and he was hired from his first day on the job. Um, he said we should collaborate on a book about John. And,
Hmm.
I said, great. I was a young writer looking for a story. And, this story pretty much walked through the door one day in the form of my friend Fred. And, he was hired in 1979, early 1979.
Hmm.
And John was murdered in December 1980. And, we started working on this book seriously soon after that happened. And it was Memorial Day weekend, 1981, that Fred comes to my house with John Lennon's diaries. And he told me that when he was in Bermuda with John during the
Hmm.
summer of 1980, when John was working on the demo tape for what became his last album, Double Fantasy,
Hmm.
he had told Fred that he had a premonition of his death and that if something should happen to him, he wanted Fred to write the true story of his life
Wow.
and to, avail himself of whatever research material he needed. And it was on Memorial Day weekend that he brought me John's diaries.
Wow.
And I eventually transcribed every single word in the diaries. And uh, that is a short version of how I came to possess John's diaries and write the book Nowhere Man.
Wow. That's amazing. And, what did you really like learn from it? What did you take away from it? Learn about John Lennon and that aspect of
Uh,
being
well,
so
yeah,
detailed of what he wrote about in his diaries.
yeah, he was obsessive about keeping the diaries, and he wrote in them every single day. Just like I had been doing, in these notebooks. So like
Hmm.
I immediately understood, what he was what he was doing. And these were the years they covered, 1975 through 1980 when he was killed. And these were the years he had dropped out of the public view and stopped talking to the media to be a house husband and raise his son Sean. So there was a myth created about the Lennons, during this period that, he was a happy bread baking house husband. And what came across in the diaries was a person who was consumed by jealousy of Paul McCartney, that he thought about Paul virtually every single day. And he always saw his life as being either up or down in relation to Paul. And at this time, Paul was, out there all the time doing concert tours, putting out hit records. And John was, pretty much home, doing very little, watching TV, smoking weed, spending time with his son, Sean, and keeping a diary. So, I learned that he was outrageously jealous and petty towards Paul McCartney. That in early 1980, one of the most startling things I learned, which has become pretty well known now, was that Paul and his band Wings were going on tour in Japan in early 1980. And on the way to Japan, Paul stopped by New York City and called John. And he asked John if he could come by and, maybe they could smoke some weed together. And, John just said, "No, I don't want to see you." And he found out in the course of this conversation that when Paul was in Japan, he was going to be staying in the presidential suite of the Okura Hotel, which John and Yoko considered their private suite. And he was infuriated that they were going to be staying in what he considered his private suite. And he asked Yoko if she could use her magical powers to have, to stop McCartney from doing this. And what happened was, when Paul got to Japan and was passing through customs, he was arrested for marijuana. He was he was trying to take marijuana through customs. They threw him in jail for 10 days. The tour was ruined, and, he had to leave Japan. And John was absolutely ecstatic over Paul being busted and the tour being ruined, which, leads me to another thing that I found really strange and surprising about the diaries, was how deeply John and Yoko were into occult practices, magic, tarot, astrology, numerology. This is what they did. They believed that they could control the universe through the use of magic. And at one point, they had a full-time tarot card reader whose name was Charlie Swan. His real name was John Green, but they called him Charlie Swan, the Oracle. He was their full-time tarot card reader. And he went with Yoko to Colombia, the country in South America, where Charlie hooked her up with a powerful bruja, a witch, who she paid $60,000 to teach her how to cast magic spells.
Oh, wait. You paid a witch $60K to cast spells.
To learn how to cast magic spells.
Oh, to learn how to do it herself. Wow.
Yes.
Maybe that's why she's lived so long. Does make sense now. She's
still living, 91 years old.
She did. She definitely still is. That is true. Wow, that is amazing. And, I've heard the stories about John Lennon and Paul McCartney, but I never thought they ever were that. I mean, that, I would say mad at each other, but had that kind of level of intensity to one another. But man,
what John said about Paul in the journals was that he loved him like a brother, but he couldn't stand being around him.
Yeah. Yeah, that's tough. And whew, wow, that's crazy. Well, we'll get into a Brooklyn memoir. Like I said, you use several taboo words, and what were, well, I think, first off, what was your kind of purpose of writing the book? And then ideally, what were some of the taboo words you used?
Okay.
And
The purpose of writing the book was after I finally finished Nowhere Man and it was
Mhm.
published. It was time to write another book.
Okay.
And the book that I wrote after Nowhere Man was Beaver Street, the history of pornography book.
Yeah.
And the opening chapter of Beaver Street takes place in my father's candy store on Church Avenue in Brooklyn, which is
Hmm.
where from the time from before I was born until 1965, I think, my father owned a candy store on Church Avenue, and I pretty much grew up there, spent a lot of time there, and the opening scene in Beaver Street takes place in the candy store, and it's my father and his cronies, and they're hanging out smoking cigarettes, and in the back of the store, my father has this special rack with all the dirty books in it, and
Mm.
like they're reading the dirty books, and like they're talking about them. Last
Right.
day to Brooklyn and Tropic Cancer and all this, and I'm like 9 years old, and I'm sitting there making change for the newspapers, and listening to these conversations. They're talking
Yeah.
about World War II and the battle of the Bulge, and like to a 9-year-old kid, this is all fascinating. So anyway, that's how Beaver Street starts.
Okay.
And after I finished Beaver Street, I'm
Hmm.
thinking, this opening section of Beaver Street, I was barely scratching the surface, and I thought that there was something happening in Flatbush at that time in that place that is worth exploring more deeply.
Mm.
So I started writing down everything I could remember about the time and place.
Right.
And after like must have been 2 years or so, I had 400 single space pages of like notes and fragments and anecdotes and things like that. And I started going through it, these
Hmm.
400 pages, looking for common themes. And what jumped out at me was Nazis, that everybody was always talking about the Nazis. And that's
Wow.
because Flatbush at the time
Hmm.
was a place where, for whatever reason, a lot of Holocaust survivors came, after the war.
Right.
And, that a lot of people of my father's age were World War II veterans who fought the Nazis. And, that was what people talked about a lot. And it was like World War II had not really ended. Like the war hung over Flatbush and Brooklyn like a
Right.
mass hallucination.
Mm.
And the other thing, which is something I did not realize till I started writing the book and going through these 400 pages of notes, was that it just like dawned on me one day. It was like, holy shit, these people have been to concentration camps, they've been
Uh,
through the war. I grew up, everybody, all the kids in the neighborhood at that time grew up surrounded by adults who must have been, they must have had PTSD,
yeah.
that post traumatic stress disorder.
Yeah.
And um, people were very angry. They were traumatized.
Of
You know,
course.
a neighborhood of traumatized people, and of course, it affects the kids.
Hmm.
And because of it, because of what so many people in the neighborhood had been through, like you walked around and you saw people with the concentration camp numbers on
Mm.
their arms, and I was like
Right.
4 years old when I asked my mother. We were waiting in the bakery one day, and I see the woman behind the counter has this number on her arm, and I say to my mother,
Mm.
what is that? And she bends down and she whispers in my ear, she was in Auschwitz. The numbers, the Nazis gave everybody there a number. And, that once I learned that at age 4, I just started seeing these numbers everywhere. And it was like, what? Holy shit, how many people in this neighborhood were in Auschwitz? A lot. And, this is like the information I'd been absorbing as a child. And one thing that, all this trauma, the concentration camp, the war, the death, all that, the effect that it had on these people was they were full of hatred.
Yeah.
They were full of hatred for everybody outside the tribe. And what the tribe was mostly Jewish. And, anybody outside the tribe, Black people, Puerto Rican people, Italians, Irish, they were the enemy. And you were asking about the taboo words. That what I tried to do in a Brooklyn memoir was recreate the atmosphere of that neighborhood at the time and the way people talked. Flatbush at the time was a segregated neighborhood. It was white. It was a white neighborhood. In my grade school, there were 2 Black kids. 2. We just did not come in contact with people like that. And the reason I used the taboo words is because I wanted the authenticity of the language. That this is the way people talk. This is the way everybody talked. Everybody used those words. Everybody used the N-word. They used, the nasty words, for the Irish and the Italians and, everybody, the Puerto Ricans. I hung out in the candy store. I heard it all the time. I went to school. I heard it all the time. And that is why I use the taboo words. That, I thought about that long and hard. That, do I really want to do this? And I just came to the conclusion, that if this book is to be a genuinely authentic portrait, then I have to use those words. And, obviously, if you take it out of context, you have to keep it in context and see what I'm doing there. And, I know people are going to be offended, but, no, I have not heard one word about how I shouldn't have done it.
Well, I think it goes back to what you said, is taking it into context, you're really, you're telling the story. And like you said, you really want people to connect with it. And I think having that authentic voice is really important, because you can tell if it's, I wouldn't say too updated, but if it's not something that's on par with like the story you're telling, it's not going to come off as a really connection that the reader's going to make to the story. If that makes any sense. They're going to read it, but they're not going to feel as connected. So I do understand the point of that. And I think with artistry, we do get these sense of levels of censorships and we think of certain things, but I do agree with you that I feel you do need to be as authentic as possible, and really, if you're selling the story, really pull into what's really going on and what's happening at those times to really captivate your audience and your readers.
I wanted people to feel it. And just, this is the way people talk. And, it's true.
Yeah.
If you don't want to hear about it, it's like this whole thing with the Voting Rights Act that, people think, oh, the Voting Rights Act, that was like the former Confederate states. No, New York City, Brooklyn was, they were subject to the Voting Rights Act.
Yeah.
Yeah. And, like the cops in Flatbush, at a certain point when I was still living there, I finally left when I was like 22 years old. But I was there from 0 through 22.
Yeah.
And when I got to be in my 20s, I became a hippie. My hair grew long, and the cops in that neighborhood, I could not drive around the block without getting pulled over by the cops. And there was one time I was hanging out on a street corner at night. I was maybe 17 years old. My hair was just starting to get long. cop car pulls over. They put me up against the car and they strip search me. Those were the cops in Flatbush. All
Wow.
these years later, the 1990s, the Abner Louiba thing happens. That was the guy, the Haitian guy who the cops arrested for some reason, and they took him back to the precinct, and they raped him with like
Wow.
a plunger handle or something like that. And I heard that story, and I'm thinking, these were the same fucking cops who were, strip searching hippies on street corners, for no reason, and it didn't surprise me. And that was Flatbush. It was just a neighborhood that was brimming with hatred, and it was a provincial neighborhood. Even though it was only like a 20-minute train ride from Manhattan. Less than 20 minutes probably. And, when I finally moved to Manhattan, it was a different world. But, how segregated was the neighborhood? There's a picture. It's taken 1964, probably October 1964. Lyndon Johnson was running for president. Bobby Kennedy was running for senator of New York State. They came down Church Avenue in an open limousine, Bobby Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson. And there was just this massive crowd on both sides of the street. And there's this picture of the crowd. Actually, they're passing right by my father's candy store. But I came upon this picture a couple of years ago, and I looked at it. And I'm telling you, you could see at least 1,000 people pretty clearly on both sides. And there's not one dark face in the crowd. That was how segregated Flatbush was. And today it's a Haitian neighborhood. It's a black, and it's just like changed so dramatically. But that's why all the white people left.
Move on out somewhere new. Yeah. And they take over the neighborhood and the world, but that's gentrification at its best. Let's talk a little bit.
Story of Flatbush.
Yeah. Let's talk about the effects you did working in pornography. You said for 16 years. It was 16 years you did it?
Yeah.
16 years. What was that experience like? How did you get involved with that? And what was that experience like for you?
I worked in pornography. Okay. This in 1983, soon after the Lennon thing ended. All right. Nowhere Man. I wrote Nowhere Man. It didn't get published for 18 years, which is like a whole nother story that you could read about in the book, and why it didn't get published. Between the time I wrote the book and it finally got published and changed my life, that I needed a job. So I was looking through the help wanted ads in 1983, and I saw this ad for an adult entertainment magazine, and they were looking for an editor. No real experience needed, but somebody who's a good writer. So I applied for it. I got the job, and it was with High Society magazine. And what had happened just before I got the job was that High Society had come up with this thing called free phone sex. And what happened was you dialed this, it was a 976 number at the time. And what happened was the phone company monopoly, AT&T, had gotten broken up by government decree. And all these little phone companies started falling into private hands. And the publisher of High Society, this guy Carl Ruderman, who you probably never heard of, but he was a multimillionaire publisher. He was able to get his hands on, I think, 3 976 lines. And what these lines were before he took them over, they were like for horoscopes, sports scores, things like that. And he got the idea that he could turn these lines into phone sex lines, that you call this number. It costs a few cents, like 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 15 cents,
Mm-hmm.
and
15 cents. Oh, wow.
yeah, that he would get 2 cents. It was all done by computer. It was recordings that were digitally recorded and put on a computer, so that when you call the line, a computer picks up, and you hear a woman on the other end talking dirty, and that's what people were paying the 15 cents for. And Carl Ruderman got 2 cents, and the phone company got the other 13 cents. And this thing was so successful that at 2 cents per call, it started generating for him $70,000 per week.
70,000
per
a week.
It was just like people from all over the country, all over the world were calling.
Wow.
And it was like this sudden influx of money. And he used the money to expand the magazine, hire new people. So, I floated into pornography on this like river of phone sex money. And I was very good at it. I was, very good at, the writing part of it, writing erotica, things like that. Mm-hmm. And it went on for 16 years until I got the book deal for Nowhere Man when I left. And, it was an interesting job that, I only worked for high society for about 1 year. Then after that, I moved to Swank Publications. And, it just went on until the internet came in and pretty much destroyed the magazine business.
Oh, sure. Yeah. It was like
that. And
wow, that's amazing. And then did you ever take anything that you learned from that experience and put that into anything you've written or thought about writing? Or
I wrote the book Beaver Street, which is like, Beaver Street is like a serious history of the late 20th century, late 20th century technology, politics, society, and it's all seen through a pornographic lens. That pornography was just this like huge business where all these people were making a fortune from it, from phone sex, from just publishing the magazines. And, I turned Beaver Street, it's a serious history that reads like a comic novel. That, a lot of the stuff that went on was outrageous. And like, I saw a lot of things. I had like a ringside seat from the transition from analog to digital.
Wow.
And, one thing about pornography that I talk about in the book, anytime a new technology comes along, like the computer, that the first people to figure out how to make a profit off it are pornographers. It's like, way back in the 1700s when the camera was invented. It's like the first word spoken when somebody invented the camera was, let's shoot some pornography. And
the first thing they think about, let's shoot some porn.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And, when Thomas Edison invented the movie camera, it didn't take him long before he started shooting, scantily clad dancing women. And, this was where he made his money to fund his invention factory.
Wow.
So it's just like, on and on, all through history. Somebody invents the printing press. The first thing they do, let's print a Bible. Okay, we printed a Bible. The second thing, oh, wow, they got this printing press. Let's print some pornography. And they did.
And it goes on and on and on. That's actually very true, too. Now I think about it, that makes a lot of sense. New technologies is the first thing they come up with. Wow. Well, that's amazing. And so I know you talked a little bit about your next book. Now, where are you in the process on your next book? Are you still in the beginning stages?
I'm about halfway through it.
Okay.
And, it's a book about the 1970s and the student left and the anti-war movement giving way to the despair of punk when, Nixon's president Agnew's vice president. The war goes on, and these people have been trying for so hard for so long to end the war. The student anti-war movement, and the war did not end, and you just kind of reach a point around 1973, 1974, where despair sets in, and there's nothing you could do. You just give in to the despair, and the reaction to the despair is just to lash out with outrage for the sake of outrage. And that was punk. And this newspaper, Observation Post at City College, that I was there as it transitioned from a voice of the student left to this, over-the-top pornographic punk scandal sheet. And it's kind of a microcosm of what was happening throughout society at the time.
Wow. And that'd be that was such crazy times, but also just historically so much went on, and it sounds like it'd be a really good read. So looking forward to that. It sounds amazing. Robert, where can people learn more information about you and your books? You have a website?
The easiest thing is to go to my website, which is robertrosennYC.com. You can find me on Facebook, on Twitter, on Instagram, on Threads. I'm on all the social media except for TikTok. For TikTok, I have not gotten around to TikTok, but
it might be banned in the next couple of months, so who knows?
Yeah. But, the easiest thing, just go to my website, robertrosennYC.com. You could write to me through it. You could, read all about my books, find out where to buy them, and all the usual there. All of them are available everywhere books are sold.
That's amazing. Well, Robert, thank you so much for talking with us. It's been such an enlightening conversation. So much history you've shared with us. I really appreciate taking the time, and definitely I'll have people check out your website, and we look forward to the next book. And do you think you'll be somewhere at the end of this year? You think it might be published?
I'm halfway through it. It's taken me quite a few years to write. Let's put it this way. If I got an advance, I would be able to knock it off in a year. If somebody, put a pile of money on my desk and said, have it by the end of the year, I would do that.
You made it happen. Yeah.
Yeah. Without, just like going at it day after day, on my own initiative, it might take a couple of more years. So, we just have to see what happens. The writing business is very tricky. And, I am looking for a commercial opening.
Yeah.
And,
okay.
If I see it, I will be charging through it.
Well, I wish you all the best of luck, Robert. And thank you again for being on. Really appreciate it.
Okay. Thank you, Dak. It was a pleasure.
You too.